Good morning, and thanks so much for joining me once again. Before I start today's message, I just want to take a moment and share with you why Martin Luther King Jr. weekend is so important, not only for all of us, but for those of us at Woodland Hills Community Church in particular. On January 15th, 1961, the day of his 33rd birthday, Martin Luther King Jr. made an appearance at Woodland Hills Community Church. He preached 2 services that morning and then later in the day went on to give a community address at Canoga Park High School. So while Martin and his dream is important to all of us, it has a very special and very personal connection for us at Woodland Hills Community Church. So having said that, let me then begin by sharing this week's message. In the reading from the Gospel of John that you're about to hear, today we get to hear a story that is told in none of the other 3 canonical Gospels. And the story involves what is laid out as the first of 7 miracles or signs that Jesus performs in John's Gospel. Now, the Gospel of John is unique in that it is the only one of the 4 that refers to these extraordinary acts Jesus performs as signs. And the authors of John use that term because for them, it wasn't the act itself that was most important. No, what mattered most to them, Ernest Hess noted, was that each of those signs pointed, and I quote, beyond themselves to what was being revealed through them. So what was this first sign? Well, it was the moment Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana. Now, the story you'll hear is short. In fact, it contains just 216 words. And while each of those 216 words are important, there are 5 in particular that can give us a tremendous insight into who Jesus really was and how he calls his followers to be in the world as he models that. Those 5 little words come in the form of an observation shared innocently by Jesus' mother near the start of the story. So listen carefully as I read John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 from the Common English Bible. And then when I finish, let's come back together and see how we can put those words into action, both in our lives individually and in our world. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Now, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. When the wine had run out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." Jesus replied, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My time hasn't come yet." His mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish cleansing ritual, each able to hold about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill those jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. Then Jesus told them, "Now draw some from them and take it to the head waiter." And they did. The head waiter tasted the water that had become wine. He didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The head waiter called the groom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and they bring out the second-rate wine only when the guests are drinking freely. But you kept the good wine until now." This was the first miraculous sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And thus ends the sacred reading. So now that you've heard the passage, you know the 5 words Jesus' mother spoke. They don't have any wine. Let me take a moment and share why I feel those 5 words are so key. The primary reason has to do with how Jesus goes about addressing needs that are in the world. Now, this is a pattern that is consistent in the miracle stories in each of the Gospels. For you see, when Jesus moves through the world and bumps into a need, he rarely names it for others. Instead, he waits until another names that need before he jumps in and gets involved. For you see, Jesus wasn't clueless in today's story. He, like most of the guests in the back near the proverbial kitchen or serving area, would have known that they were running short of wine at least. And yet, Jesus waited for his mother to name that need. Why? Because throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus was anything but a one-person show. Time after time, he had a knack for creating space for others to step in and get involved in that process of meeting a need. He waited for those like his own mother to come along and do what Carol Lakey Hess called nudging God with their observation. And in that nudging, she and we become co-creators with God in the effort to meet that need. Now, thinking about how Jesus's way of being provides a perfect backdrop for us as we celebrate the civil rights giant Martin Luther King Jr. this weekend. For you see, we so often think of Martin Luther King Jr. in a very specific, particular way, as one who did great things himself. And he certainly did. But you know, as one of Martin's fellow pastors, I tend to see him a little different. I think of him as a man who inspired and equipped millions of others for generations to do great things as well. Let me share with you an experience I had that made me relate to Martin this way. Way back when I was in high school in the 1980s, the United States Congress was debating whether or not to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. And one morning, as the debate was raging, I sat at the breakfast table with my father, reading the coverage. And when I spoke up and expressed my hope that they would declare Martin's birthday a national holiday, my dad was uncharacteristically silent. Now, he was normally quick to share his take on things, so I did what any other self-respecting teenager would do. When met with silence, I confronted him. "What's wrong, Dad? Don't you support the MLK holiday?" "Well," we began, "I am older than you. And I have to say, I lived through those things, and so I have a different perception of Dr. King. For you see, I remember that King would go into those communities, get people all worked up, and then leave. And 2 or 3 days later, there would often be violence that broke out in the community. He left. I know he talked about nonviolence," Dad ended, "but it sure seems as if he stirred up a lot of trouble." It was clear that we weren't going to see things eye to eye that morning, so I let the conversation sort of die off. And while that breakfast conversation lasted only a few seconds, its memory is stuck with me for a lifetime. For it was in that conversation that I learned what this thing called white privilege really is. And I learned over 30 years ago before it became a phrase that many use. For you see, as I look back on the conversation, what my father failed to understand was that Martin went into communities and had the audacity to do what Jesus' mother did in today's story. He had the nerve to name things that needed to be named. And because of it, those words he spoke and wrote nudged God and others into action. His words inspired millions of Americans, black and white, to finally wake up and begin addressing those long ignored problems. Now, my father and those who benefited from the systems that had been in place since the country's inception tended to call what came from Martin's words trouble. But I and so many others of us call what came from the words something else, justice. And that's why at this time we honor this man who, like Jesus' mother, nudged things along. There's one other easily overlooked detail of this morning's story that I think can give us a deeper appreciation of what Martin and the civil rights movement is all about. And it has to do with the 6 containers or pots that went from being empty to being full of wine. Now, in speaking of those oft ignored containers, Linda McInnish Bridges noted that those 6 pots were typically used, as the scripture said, for ritual cleansing in Jesus' time. And they represented what Bridges called the old order. And Jesus took those empty pots, that old order, and produced something that was new and amazing. Bridges says it produced overflowing vats of wine that never ran dry. And that, friends, is what Martin did as well. For as author and Presbyterian elder James McBride Dabbs once wrote, religion at the time of MLK was primarily a day and a place. Religion was Sunday and the church. Everything else was life. Religion back then was a curious, quiet, and inconsequential moment in the existence of most. Religion came around once a week, but it didn't seem to have much to do, really, with the rest of life. And then along came Martin Luther King Jr., and he changed that way of being forever. From the earliest days of that Montgomery bus boycott, Martin nudged the church itself to stop being inconsequential to the rest of life. And because of his work with many groups, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the church today is no longer as inconsequential as it had been to those social movements prior to the 1950s. The progressive church in particular has been a hotbed for dissent, for those working on everyday causes like women's rights, the rights of the differently able, the rights of LGBTQIA+ people, economic rights, voting rights, immigration. You name the cause, and faithful followers of Jesus are still today responding to the nudge that Martin gave us 60+ years ago. Because he was so powerful, millions of us are working hard every day to keep his dream alive. Now, I know that for some, this might seem like a hard time to celebrate advancements of rights. For as we turn on the news and listen to the reports, it seems as if we are facing unprecedented efforts to limit or restrict voting rights. And many of us feel hopeless because of that. Well, if that's where you are today, I want to end my time with you by encouraging you to hold on tightly to this morning's story. For that water into wine story teaches us that the old order or the world will always tell us the same thing, that the jars around us are empty, that there isn't enough to go around, whether that be things like voting rights or services. And yet our faith tells us exactly the opposite, that there is more than enough to go around. For as Jesus' mother and Martin remind us through their naming and nudging, we live in a world of abundance. And as Robert Brearley wrote in response to today's story, this joyous feast at Cana is still a sign to the church and its people that we are to rejoice and we are to toast the world with the news of amazing grace. My prayer is that we will honor Martin's legacy this year by doing just that, toasting the world and sharing with it the abundance of goodwill and grace that can't help but bring God's reign of justice and peace a little closer each day. May it be so, and we'll see you next week.